"Don't touch her," someone said too late, right as the sound of fabric tearing cut clean through the low hum of conversation like a knife through glass. For a split second, the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe. Crystal chandeliers hung above polished marble floors, casting warm gold light over pressed suits, silk dresses, and the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. And right in the center of it all, Naomi Carter stood frozen, her tray tilted slightly in her hand, the edge of her uniform dress pulled loose where a man's careless grip had turned attention into something sharp and humiliating. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed forward, steady, as if she had practiced this moment her whole life, even though no one ever should. Around her, the laughter came in uneven waves, some nervous, some entertained, some pretending not to notice. The man responsible leaned back in his chair like he'd just made a joke worth remembering, his smile wide, careless, the kind that came from never being told no. "Relax," he muttered, loud enough for the table and anyone close enough to hear. "It's just a waitress. Just a waitress." The words landed heavier than the silence that followed. Naomi adjusted her grip on the tray, slow, controlled, like her hands belonged to someone else. A glass shifted. Ice clinked. Somewhere across the room, a fork paused halfway to a plate. Time stretched thin, pulled tight between what had just happened and what might come next. No one stepped forward. Not the manager near the bar, not the couple seated closest to her, not even the man's companions who suddenly found their drinks far more interesting than the scene unfolding in front of them. This was how it worked here. Power moved quietly, and discomfort was something people learned to swallow with expensive wine. Naomi took a single breath, measured and silent. Her shoulders straightened. Not defensive. Not broken. Just, unshaken in a way that didn't fit the moment. And that was when it shifted. Not in the center of the room, where all eyes were pretending not to look, but in the far corner where the light didn't quite reach. A man sat there, alone. His posture relaxed, one hand resting loosely around a glass he hadn't touched in minutes. From a distance, there was nothing remarkable about him. No raised voice. No sudden movement. But the air around his table felt different, like a storm gathering without wind. His gaze had been still before. Now, it wasn't. It moved, slow, deliberate, settling on Naomi with a focus that erased everything else in the room. The laughter faded first. Then the whispers. Not because anyone said a word, but because something invisible had shifted direction. The man's fingers tightened just slightly around the glass, not enough to make a sound, but enough to change the shape of his hand. His expression didn't harden. It didn't need to. Control like his didn't announce itself. It waited. Naomi lowered the tray onto the nearest table with quiet precision, the soft clink of porcelain somehow louder than the earlier noise. She didn't look at the man who had grabbed her. She didn't look at anyone. Her voice, when it came, was calm. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" It wasn't submission. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. And across the room, the man in the shadows leaned back just slightly, his eyes never leaving her, as if in that single moment, something had locked into place that couldn't be undone. The room did not return to normal after that moment, it only pretended to, like a song restarting after the needle had already scratched the record, and Naomi Carter moved through it as if nothing had happened, one step at a time, her posture straight, her pace measured, every motion controlled down to the smallest detail, because control was the only thing she had ever been allowed to keep, and she was not about to lose it here, not in front of strangers who had already decided who she was. The second they saw the uniform, the tray, the quiet way she existed without being noticed until something went wrong, and as she reached the service station near the back, she set the tray down with the same precision she used for everything else in her life, the kind that came from years of knowing mistakes cost more when you looked like her, when you came from where she came from. When you worked twice as hard just to be seen as half as much, and behind the swinging kitchen doors, the noise softened into something dull and distant, voices blending into the clatter of plates and the low hum of orders being called out, but even there, the air felt different, heavier, like something had followed her in, something unseen but impossible to ignore, and one of the other waitstaff glanced at her, eyes flicking briefly to the edge of her dress before quickly looking away, not out of cruelty, but out of the quiet agreement everyone in places like this seemed to understand: do not get involved, do not make it worse, do not become the next person standing alone in the middle of the room. And Naomi did not blame them, she never did, because she had learned a long time ago that silence was often survival, and yet something inside her refused to fold completely, refused to shrink the way it used to when she was younger, when she still believed that dignity was something other people could take from you. Now she knew better, now she knew it was something you either held on to or you lost forever, and so she reached for a fresh order, her hand steady, her expression neutral, as if the moment out there had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. But the truth was, the room had changed, not because of what had been done, but because of who had seen it, and back beyond the soft glow of the dining area, past the tables and the low conversations trying to rebuild themselves, the man in the corner had not looked away once, not when she moved, not when she disappeared behind the doors, not even when one of the staff approached his table with cautious politeness and asked if he needed anything else. His response was a quiet no, delivered without shifting his gaze, because his attention was no longer on the menu, or the room, or even the man who had caused the scene. It was fixed entirely on Naomi Carter, as if the world had narrowed down to a single point. And she was standing at the center of it, and for the first time that night, something unfamiliar settled beneath his calm exterior, not anger, not exactly, but something colder, more deliberate. Something that did not rush, did not react, but waited, observed, calculated, and decided, because men like him did not step in without purpose, they did not move without reason, and whatever line had just been crossed in that room, it had not gone unnoticed, not by him, and when he finally lifted his glass, the motion was slow, controlled, the kind that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could, because somewhere between the sound of tearing fabric and the silence that followed, something had already shifted in a way no one else in that room fully understood yet, something that would not stay contained behind polite smiles and lowered eyes for much longer. When Naomi stepped back onto the floor, the rhythm of the restaurant had almost repaired itself, almost, because beneath the polished surface and carefully restored conversations, something unsettled still lingered, like a crack beneath glass that had not yet shattered but could at any moment, and she moved through it with the same quiet precision, carrying a fresh tray, her expression composed, her focus fixed on the tasks in front of her, because routine was safer than reflection, and reflection would only pull her back to the moment she refused to replay. Yet the room would not let it go so easily, not when the man at the center of it all was still seated there, still leaning back with that same careless confidence, now louder than before, as if attention itself had become something he enjoyed, his voice cutting through the air with casual remarks that drew scattered laughter from those who preferred to align themselves with comfort rather than conscience. And he lifted his glass again, gesturing loosely as he spoke, his eyes drifting across the room until they landed on Naomi once more, not with curiosity, but with the same dismissive amusement that had started everything. And this time, he did not even pretend subtlety. "Hey," he called out, not loudly, but just enough to carry, just enough to make sure she heard it, just enough to pull the attention of those nearby without breaking the illusion of sophistication the room tried so hard to maintain. "You missed a spot," he added, nodding toward an already spotless section of the table, and a few people nearby smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than not reacting at all. And Naomi paused for half a second, just enough for the moment to register, just enough for the weight of it to settle, before she stepped forward again, her movement steady, controlled, placing the tray down with the same deliberate care, her voice calm when she responded. "I will take care of it," she said, even though there was nothing to fix. And for a brief moment, the man's smile widened, satisfied, as if the interaction had confirmed exactly what he believed about the world and the people in it. But something else happened in that same second, something quieter, something far less obvious, because across the room, the man in the shadows finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a subtle shift that carried more intention than any raised voice could, his chair sliding back just enough to break the stillness of his corner, the faint sound of wood against polished floor barely audible, yet somehow louder than the laughter that had filled the room moments earlier. and the staff member who had approached him before hesitated again, watching carefully now, because even without knowing exactly why, there was a sense that whatever happened next would not follow the same script as everything that came before, and as he stood, his presence seemed to redraw the space around him, conversations thinning, eyes shifting, attention recalibrating in ways people did not consciously choose, and still, he did not speak, not yet, his gaze moving once more to Naomi, then briefly to the man who had called out to her, measuring, assessing, as if placing both of them within a framework only he could see, and in that silent calculation, something became clear, not to the room, not to the man still smiling at his own reflection in the moment, but to the one person who had been watching from the beginning. This was no longer about a passing incident, no longer about a careless action brushed aside by polite society. This was something else now, something that had crossed into a space where indifference no longer applied, and Naomi, unaware of the shift that had just taken place behind her, finished adjusting the untouched setting, lifting the tray again, ready to move on as she always did, unaware that this time, the moment was not going to let her. The moment he stood, the room did not stop, but it shifted in a way that felt almost imperceptible at first, like a change in pressure before a storm, and yet those closest to him felt it immediately, a subtle tightening in the air, a quiet awareness that something had entered the space that did not belong to the usual rhythm of polite conversation and curated appearances. And Alexander Volkov moved forward without urgency, without hesitation, each step measured, unhurried, as if time itself adjusted to accommodate him rather than the other way around, his presence threading through the room with a kind of quiet authority that did not need introduction, did not need explanation, and the staff member who had been standing near the service station instinctively stepped aside without being asked, not out of fear, but out of recognition of something they could not quite name, and Naomi, still focused on her work, did not notice him at first, her attention fixed on the tray in her hands. On the sequence of movements that had always kept her grounded, because routine was the only constant she trusted, but the closer he came, the more the space around her seemed to change, conversations softening, glances shifting, as if the room itself was beginning to reorient around a new center, and it was not until she turned slightly, preparing to move toward another table, that she saw him, not fully, not yet, just the outline of someone standing closer than expected, someone who did not belong to the category she had learned to navigate so carefully, and for a fraction of a second, her steps paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of instinct, because something about him did not match the rest of the room, and across from them, the man who had been so comfortably loud moments before leaned back again, still unaware, still wrapped in the ease of someone who believed nothing could touch him here, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of his glass, his attention only partially on the unfolding shift, until Alexander stopped, not directly in front of Naomi, but just close enough to redraw the invisible lines of the space, and when he finally spoke, his voice was not raised, not sharp, but calm, steady, carrying across the immediate area with a clarity that did not invite interruption. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, not to Naomi, not even fully to the man at the table, but to the moment itself, and the effect was immediate. The laughter that had lingered around the edges dissolved, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate rather than accidental, and for the first time, the man at the table looked up with something closer to attention than amusement, his expression shifting as he tried to place the figure standing nearby, to understand why the room no longer felt like it belonged to him, and Naomi stood still, the tray balanced perfectly in her hands, her posture unchanged, but her awareness sharpened. Because whatever this was, it was no longer part of the script she knew how to follow, and Alexander's gaze moved briefly to her, not lingering, not invasive, but precise, as if confirming something only he could see, before returning to the man across from him, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed, not between them, but through the space itself. A quiet declaration that the balance of the room had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not tonight, not anymore. The question did not hang in the air for long, but the silence that followed it felt deliberate, like the room itself was waiting to see who would answer first, and the man at the table shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence no longer quite as effortless as it had been moments before, his smile tightening just slightly as he looked up, trying to read the situation, trying to decide whether this was something to dismiss or something to take seriously, and for the first time that night, uncertainty touched his expression, subtle but undeniable. "No problem," he said after a beat, his tone still casual, but not as loud, not as careless, as if instinct was quietly advising him to adjust, to recalibrate, even if he did not fully understand why. And Alexander did not respond immediately. He did not challenge the answer, did not raise his voice, did not escalate the moment in any visible way. Instead he simply stood there, his presence steady, his gaze fixed with a kind of quiet intensity that made the absence of reaction feel heavier than any confrontation could have been. And that was when it began to ripple outward, not from words, but from recognition, because across the room, someone near the bar leaned slightly toward another guest, whispering something under their breath, a name perhaps, or a question, and then another glance followed, then another, until the awareness started to spread in small, controlled waves, subtle enough that no one could point to the exact moment it began, but undeniable once it did, and the manager, who had been hovering near the entrance earlier, suddenly straightened, his posture sharpening as if a switch had been flipped inside him, his eyes moving quickly toward Alexander, then away, then back again, confirmation settling in, and Naomi felt it too, not the recognition, not the name, but the shift, the way the room had quietly rearranged itself around the man standing beside her, the way people who had ignored her moments before were now paying attention, not to her, but to him, and through him, indirectly, to her. And it was disorienting in a way she could not fully explain, because nothing visible had changed, and yet everything had, and Alexander finally moved again, just a small step forward, enough to close the space between himself and the table, his hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, not gripping it, not claiming it, just placing it there with a kind of casual precision that carried more meaning than the gesture itself. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, measured, but this time there was something else beneath it, something quieter, something firmer. "Then I suggest we keep it that way," he said, not as a threat, not as a command, but as a statement that did not require agreement to be understood, and the man at the table nodded almost immediately, a reflex more than a decision, his earlier bravado fading into something more cautious, more contained, as if the boundaries of the moment had suddenly become clear in a way they had not been before, and around them, the room exhaled slowly, tension easing but not disappearing, because whatever had just happened had not resolved anything completely, it had only drawn a line, one that had not existed before. And Naomi, still standing with the tray balanced in her hands, realized something she had not expected to feel, not relief, not exactly, but awareness, sharp and precise, that she was no longer invisible in the way she had been just minutes ago, and that realization carried a weight of its own, because attention, once given, did not always disappear when you wanted it to, and as Alexander's gaze returned to her for just a brief moment, there was no question in it, no uncertainty, only a quiet recognition that something had begun here, something that neither of them had planned, but neither of them would be able to ignore. The line had been drawn, and even though no one said it out loud, everyone in the room understood it in their own way, some through instinct, some through quiet whispers, and some through the way their posture shifted just slightly, as if they had suddenly remembered where they were and who might be watching, and Naomi felt that change settle around her like a second layer of air, heavier, sharper, impossible to ignore. Yet she did not move any differently, did not allow it to alter the rhythm she had built for herself over years of learning how to survive spaces that were never designed for her. She simply turned, lifted the tray, and continued walking, because stopping would mean acknowledging something she was not ready to define, and behind her, Alexander remained still for a moment longer, his gaze following her path not with curiosity, but with something more focused, more deliberate, as if every movement she made was being measured against a standard only he understood, and then, without announcement, he stepped back from the table, the subtle shift signaling an end to the moment in a way that required no explanation, and the man who had been sitting there exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in the cautious awareness that whatever had just passed was not something to revisit, not tonight, not again, and around them, the room began to recover more convincingly this time, conversations resuming with slightly more confidence, laughter returning in controlled bursts, but the undercurrent remained, a quiet awareness that something had changed, something that could not be undone simply by pretending it had not happened, and Naomi moved toward the next table, setting down a fresh order with steady hands, her voice calm, her expression neutral, yet beneath that surface, her thoughts were no longer as quiet as before, because she could feel it now, the weight of attention that did not fade when she turned away, the sense that someone was still watching, not with judgment, not with dismissal, but with intent, and she had learned long ago to recognize intent as something far more dangerous than words. And as she reached for an empty glass, her fingers paused for just a fraction of a second, the smallest break in her control, before she continued, because whatever this was, it was no longer just about what had happened, it was about what would happen next, and across the room, Alexander had already returned to his table, but he did not sit immediately, instead he remained standing for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the back of the chair, his posture relaxed, yet unmistakably present, as if he had not fully stepped out of the moment he had created. And when he finally sat, it was with the same quiet precision that marked everything he did, his attention no longer hidden in the shadows, but not openly displayed either, simply there, steady, unwavering, and the manager, who had been watching carefully from a distance, made a decision then, one that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but carried weight within the structure of the room. He moved quickly toward Naomi, his tone low, controlled, but urgent in a way he could not entirely conceal. "Take 5 minutes," he said, not as a suggestion, but as an instruction that came too late to be casual, and Naomi looked at him briefly, surprised not by the words, but by the timing. Because in all her time working there, no one had ever told her to step away after something like that, no one had ever offered space instead of expectation, and for a moment, she hesitated, caught between habit and something unfamiliar, before she nodded once, setting the tray down again, her movements still controlled, still precise, even as the ground beneath her certainty began to shift, and as she turned toward the back, toward the quiet of the service corridor, she did not look back, but she did not need to, because she could still feel it, that same steady presence, that same unspoken focus, following her even as she stepped out of the room, as if whatever had begun between them had not ended when the moment passed, but had only just started to take shape. The service corridor felt different the second Naomi stepped into it, the noise of the dining room fading into a distant hum, replaced by the steady rhythm of the kitchen and the muted echo of footsteps against tile, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to slow down, not enough to lose control, but enough to feel the weight of everything that had just happened settle into something real, something she could not dismiss as just another shift, just another moment to move past. Because this one had not ended when she walked away, it had followed her, pressed into the silence around her, and she leaned lightly against the counter near the back wall, her fingers resting against the cool surface, her breathing steady, measured, as if she were resetting something inside herself that had been pushed out of alignment, and for a few seconds, that was all there was, the quiet, the distance, the illusion that she was once again invisible, untouched by the world she had just stepped out of, but then the door behind her opened, not abruptly, not loudly, just enough to break the rhythm of the space, and she did not turn immediately, because she already knew, not by sound, not by sight, but by the same instinct that had told her something was different the moment he entered the room, and when she finally looked over her shoulder, Alexander was standing there, not close, not imposing, just present, as if the space had adjusted itself to include him without question, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, as if words were unnecessary to define what had already been established, and Naomi straightened slightly, her posture returning to its familiar precision, her expression composed, even as her awareness sharpened, because this was no longer the controlled environment of the dining floor, no longer a space where roles were clearly defined and expectations were easy to follow. This was something else, something unstructured, and that made it unpredictable, and yet she did not step away, did not create distance, because part of her understood that distance would not change anything now, not after the way the night had unfolded, and Alexander studied her for a brief moment, his gaze steady, not intrusive, not dismissive, but intentional, as if he were observing something rare, something that did not fit into the categories he was used to, and when he finally spoke, his voice was as calm as before, controlled, precise. "You handled that well," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, but as a simple acknowledgement, and Naomi held his gaze for a second longer than she expected to, her response coming just as steady. "It is part of the job," she replied, even though both of them knew that was not entirely true, that what had happened out there was not something anyone should have to accept as routine. And a faint shift passed through his expression, not quite approval, not quite disagreement, something more complex, something that suggested he saw through the answer without needing to challenge it, and for a brief moment, the world outside that corridor seemed to fall away completely, leaving only the space between them, defined not by status or roles, but by something quieter, something forming beneath the surface, and then, just as subtly as he had entered, Alexander took a step back, not retreating, not disengaging, but allowing the moment to breathe, to exist without being forced into something it was not yet ready to become, and Naomi exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recognition. Because whatever this was, it was not finished, not even close, and as the door behind him swung gently closed, returning the corridor to its familiar quiet, she understood something with absolute clarity: this night was not going to end the way it began, and neither was she. When Naomi stepped back onto the floor, the rhythm of the restaurant had fully restored itself on the surface, conversations flowing smoothly, glasses clinking softly, the illusion of normalcy rebuilt with practiced precision, but beneath it, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by silence, not by routine, and she felt it immediately, not as pressure, not as fear, but as awareness, sharper now, more defined, as if the space itself had changed its expectations of her. Without asking, and she moved carefully, deliberately, each step measured as she returned to her section, her posture composed, her expression neutral, yet her senses more attuned than before, and across the room, the man who had drawn attention earlier was no longer as relaxed, his posture slightly tighter, his voice lower, his laughter forced in a way that suggested something beneath the surface had unsettled him, even if he could not fully name it, and those seated around him had adjusted as well, their reactions more cautious, their glances more frequent, because even if they did not understand exactly what had happened, they understood enough to recognize that the balance had shifted away from him, and that recognition was enough to change the way they engaged with him, and Naomi approached the table again, not because she wanted to, but because it was part of the job, because avoidance was not an option in a space like this, and as she set down a fresh glass of water, her movements remained steady, her voice calm. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, her tone even, controlled, leaving no space for interpretation, and this time, the man did not respond immediately, his eyes flicking briefly past her, toward the far side of the room, toward something or someone he could not ignore anymore, and that hesitation, that brief break in his usual confidence, said more than any words could have. And Naomi felt it, not as satisfaction, not as relief, but as confirmation, that whatever had changed was not temporary, not superficial, and as she turned to leave, she caught it again, that same steady presence, not close, not intrusive, but there, unwavering, and when her gaze lifted just slightly, she saw him, seated once more, composed, his attention not hidden but not displayed either, simply existing in a way that influenced everything around it without needing to declare itself, and in that moment, something else became clear, something she had not fully understood before. This was not just about what he had done out there, not just about the line he had drawn, this was about what he was choosing not to do now, the restraint, the control, the deliberate decision to let the situation resolve itself within the boundaries he had quietly set, and that realization carried its own weight, because it meant this was not impulse, not reaction, this was intention, and Naomi turned away. Again, continuing her work, but the awareness stayed with her, the sense that she was no longer moving through the night unnoticed, that every action, every step, was now part of something larger than the shift itself, and across the room, Alexander remained still, his posture relaxed, his expression unchanged, yet beneath that calm exterior, something had already been decided, not in words, not in gestures, but in the quiet certainty that defined everything he did, and as the night moved forward, one detail became impossible to ignore for anyone paying close enough attention. The man who had once filled the room with careless confidence was now quieter, more contained, while the woman he had dismissed so easily moved through the space with a presence that had only grown stronger, and between those two shifts, the balance of the room had been rewritten in a way no one could openly acknowledge, but no one could deny either. By the time the last hour of the evening settled in, the restaurant had returned to its carefully constructed version of normal, the kind that looked effortless but was built on quiet adjustments no one openly acknowledged, and Naomi moved through it with the same steady rhythm she had carried all night, but something in her had changed, not in a way anyone could easily point to, not in her posture or her tone, but in the way she occupied the space, as if she no longer moved around the room, but through it, aware of every glance, every shift, every subtle reaction that followed her steps, and the difference was not lost on those who paid attention, because confidence, real confidence, did not need to be announced, it showed itself in the absence of hesitation, in the quiet certainty of movement, and as she cleared a table near the window, her reflection caught briefly in the glass, she saw it for herself, not the uniform, not the role, but the way she held herself despite everything that had happened, and for a moment, she allowed that realization to settle, not as pride, not as defiance, but as something simpler, something steadier, and when she turned back toward the room, her gaze moved naturally across the space until it found him. Again, not by accident, not entirely, but because some part of her had been aware of him the entire time, and Alexander sat where he had been, composed, unchanged, yet unmistakably present, as if the room still revolved around a center no one had formally recognized, and when their eyes met, it was not prolonged, not dramatic, just a brief connection, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said between them, because in that moment, there was understanding, quiet, unspoken, but clear, and then it was gone, both of them returning to their roles as if nothing had happened, as if everything had not already changed, and the night continued, orders completed, tables cleared, guests leaving one by one, until the energy of the room began to soften, winding down into something quieter, something closer to stillness, and eventually, the doors opened for the last time. The final guests stepping out into the cool night air, their conversations fading as they disappeared into the city beyond, and inside, the staff moved into closing routines, the familiar sequence of wiping surfaces, stacking chairs, resetting the space for the next day, and Naomi worked through it with the same focus she always had, but when she reached the front, near the entrance, she paused, just for a second, because something caught her attention, not a sound, not a movement, but a presence she had come to recognize without needing to see it first, and when she looked up, Alexander was standing there, not in the center of the room, not commanding attention, just near the door, as if he had been waiting without making it obvious. And the distance between them felt different now, not defined by roles or expectations, but by something that had taken shape over the course of the night, something neither of them had named, and he did not step closer immediately, did not speak right away, he simply looked at her with that same steady focus, as if confirming something one last time, and then, in the same calm, controlled tone he had used from the beginning, he said, "You do not belong here, not as an insult, not as a judgment, but as a statement of fact that carried something deeper beneath it." And Naomi held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but her awareness sharper than ever, because she understood that this was not about the restaurant, not about the job, but about something else entirely, something he had already decided, and before she could respond, before the moment could settle into something more defined, he turned, opening the door with the same quiet precision, stepping out into the night without looking back, leaving the words behind like a line drawn across everything that had come before, and Naomi stood there for a second longer, the silence around her no longer empty, but full of something unresolved, something waiting, and as she finally turned away, returning to the last of her work, one thought remained, clear and unshakable, whatever this night had started, it was not over, not even close.